I was coming into my doctoral program and into the CTL, I was not at all confident about my teaching abilities, but the CTL has really supported me in pulling from group facilitation to training facilitation that I had done in my career into a really honed sort of like pedagogical lens and teaching approach.
A specific workshop or fellowship program that was a turning point in how I view myself as an educator was the TDP program, which was my first engagement with the Center for Teaching and Learning. I was in my first year, and it was the TDP Sprint, which is the Teaching Development Sprint program, where you go through the essentials of the learning. They really reframed how I thought about teaching. Before that, I had like some experience teaching, but I'd never been trained or had anyone speak to me about this is how you should think about teaching in this way or that way. And it was really eye-opening, the sort of like skills and methods that they introduced.
When I first started as a teaching observation fellow with the CTL, I was petrified in the classroom. I was really attached to my lesson plan and didn't want to deviate based on the sense I was getting in the classroom. But as I grew as a CTL fellow and gained confidence as an instructor, I was really grateful that the CTL gave me the space to fail safely in the classroom and outside of it. And as a result of that pedagogical journey, I'm much more confident in the classroom and willing to take risks. And I know that's something my students appreciate and something that's really served me well as a communicator in the classroom and outside.
CTL programs empower me to make independent and intentional choices in my classroom in a number of ways. They introduced me to a lot of just very foundational concepts and principles in education, so things like active learning, reflective teaching, inclusive teaching, as well as a lot of the neuroscience around how learning actually works. Also things like metacognition and how to kind of work with my students to improve their own learning practices and make this really an effective learning environment for both me as their teacher and my students as the learners.
So I came in to Columbia already with a couple years of teaching experience, so I felt rather confident in my teaching capabilities, but I was still very anxious about adjusting to a new department and a new school and just a new environment in general. And by way of my involvement with the CTL and the graduate student programming at the CTL, that really helped alleviate those anxieties.
The skills that the CTL taught me not only improved my own teaching practice, but let me really speak into the practice of my peers and also to help my students. When it comes to my peers, I think some of the best examples of that occurred first in the sort of communities, the informal spaces that arose from the different seminars and workshops and just like collaborative environments that the CTL would cultivate. Those spaces really created an opportunity to talk with my peers about teaching, to be asking questions, saying, hey, what are you encountering with your students? And that kind of exchange of ideas, sort of a nascent community of practice, was one like really amazing way I would say in which both I was able to give back but also learn from my peers.
I would say that as a graduate student in a huge university, it can feel really hard to feel at all a part of the university community. For the most part, we're very siloed into our departments, and even then at the doctoral level, we often are working alone after our coursework periods. And so the CTL has been such a source of community and also has really pushed me to think about teaching as its own art and science, if you will. And so being in dialogue with folks who are teaching things like lab sciences or humanities, teaching a lesson on poetry has been so informative to my own teaching and sort of diversifying what I'm bringing into a social work classroom.
When I think about the CTL, I think one of the strongest things that I learned from the CTL was to become a strong pedagogue in the class. Someone who's independent and who's intentional about his lesson plans. And I was able to do that largely by thinking about how to articulate all of my grandest lesson plans into the simplest of ways in succinct syllabi, but more importantly in things that are student-centric that they'd find interesting.
When I looked back on some of the reviews that I'd received from students at the end of my first year and the second year, I could tell that the students were getting a lot out of it, and that was the moment that I could sort of see very visually the impact that the CTL was having. That was one of the most rewarding moments. And some of those reviews also made me cry, and I was very emotional when I was reading some of them, but yeah.